Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to LOPvox Live with your host, the Ghost Scientist. Join in our exciting conversations that are educational, informative, and oftentimes entertaining. So without further ado, this is LOPvox Live. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to LOPvox Live. This is your host, the Ghost Scientist, and we're here live on LOP Radio, here with Dane Wigington of Geoengineering Watch.org. That's geoengineeringwatch.org. And Dane, how you doing?
Good, Ghost. How are you?
Excellent, excellent. So I'll tell you what, out of everybody that I've been watching on LOP, like in the forums and people being written about, you, sir, have created a giant buzz here at Lunatic Outpost on LOP, the forum channel itself. Lots and lots of people tuning in, lots and lots of people writing on the forum about the work that you have been currently doing, the work that you've already done, and the lectures that you've been putting out on YouTube. So before we begin, just in case some of the listeners that are tuning in don't know who you are or what you're doing or what you're working on, why don't you just give a quick synopsis about who you are, what you're up to, what you're about, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, my name is Dane Wigington. I'm a lead researcher. I run the website geoengineeringwatch.org. I have a background in renewable energy. I'm a former Bechtel Power employee from some decades back. I know that Bechtel's a four-letter word now, but I moved to the Pacific Northwest to try to find clean skies because I grew up in a very smoggy Southern California. My home is off-grid completely. I was the cover of the world's largest renewable energy magazine. I'm in the middle of the wilderness, in the middle of nowhere, and soon after I moved in, I was beginning to lose, on some days, 60-70% of my solar uptake, solar PV, from whatever these aircraft were leaving behind, these grid patterns, and I dove into research on the issue and quickly came to a mountain of data on geoengineering, which is climate engineering on a global scale. I had no idea these programs were going on, but subsequent water tests, rain tests showed the exact same materials coming down, named the patents, and my life's been on hold ever since, Ghost. This is a battle that simply, once people understand the gravity of it, if we don't win this one, we lose everything.
So let's get into some meat on this subject. Now, I understand, and I've read your background, and I've read a lot of what you've already have up on geoengineeringwatch.org. That's geoengineeringwatch.org. For any of the listeners that would like to go to his website, he has tons of information that he's written. Lots of his lectures are up there that you can watch. You can also go to YouTube and of course, do a search on Dane Wigington on YouTube, and he's got several of his lectures up on YouTube as well. Here's I think, let's get to some of the meat of this. So basically you started out where you had this, you put this solar panel system in to, of course, provide alternative energy to your home, off-grid power, and then that way you weren't sectioned to the grid. And then you noticed all of a sudden that you had these big drops in power that was going to your home on certain days, and you noticed, of course, that it was, this haze or a gray haze that seemed to just get a cover over the top of your home, that then you got this loss in power. But let's start from step one, because I think people would be really interested, or the listeners would be really interested in finding out what was the first step that you took? Like, where exactly did you begin this journey, and how did that come about? Like, what kind of feeling did you get? What kind of knowledge were you getting? Where were you getting your research from? And the different places that you were going to get the knowledge and research that you got to begin with?
Well, there's no shortage of data online for anybody who chooses to look about these programs. There's 150-plus patents that relate more directly to geoengineering, which is, again, weather modification on a global scale. But once what appeared to be a primary element, which is aluminum oxide, identified in these patents, of course, what does one do first? You see if that's actually raining down on you. And the last thing I wanted to actually find in the lab tests I did was aluminum. I had hoped something was not what it appeared to be, and that these programs perhaps weren't what they appeared to be. But an initial lab test of 7 parts per billion of aluminum, and given my location, the first thing I did was talk to a hydrogeologist to see if there was any reason I should expect that in my precipitation. The answer was patently no. In fact, I to quote him directly, he said, "You shouldn't have any aluminum in your metal where you live, or in your rain where you live. unless you live next to an Alcoa factory, which obviously I don't. So the subsequent tests over the next few years, five plus years later, tests went as high as 3,450 parts per billion of aluminum in a single rain event. I mean, this is highly toxic rain, period. And although you hear people say aluminum's abundant naturally in the environment, well, yeah, it's 8% of the Earth's crust, but it's always bonded to other elements. It does not exist in the environment in free form. It doesn't blow around in the wind, or we would have no aquatic insect life, and other soil microbes would have long since been wiped out. So any notion that it should be raining down on us is patently false. And what we've seen here in the last 10 plus years, aquatic insect life and terrestrial insect life here in Northern California, as measured by a 35-year U.S. Forest Service biologist who's done it for 3.5 decades, 90% decline in both categories, aquatic insect life and terrestrial insect life. So clearly, this phenomenon has turned into an avalanche in the last decade, and it's literally imploding the environment here.
So that is where, that's where we begin the story. So let's kind of speed up. Where did you start to decide to take this on, to take this giant battle on? I know we're talking about lots of different things, and I'd like to cover all of them. Not only the geoengineering programs in which you think are the reasons behind why they're doing these particular programs, number one, maybe what they possibly, their solutions or what problem they think that they're solving by doing this. Secondly, I'd like to cover weather modification, the whole concept of it being a weather modification process. And then lastly, I'd like to cover more of the CT or conspiracy theorists, if you will, and I hate the word. I think conspiracy theorist is not the proper word for it. I like researcher myself. What other researchers think in the field as far as it being, this being chemtrails, and these chemtrails being used for Harp and all kinds of different nefarious government programs, et cetera, et cetera. So let's start out with the geoengineering. How did you decide, or when did you decide to take this on as a task, as a real charge up the hill, if you will?
I'm not a politically oriented person. I'm not an activist. I've never been, although I've always cared about the environment. But what does one do when you really have proven beyond any doubt that this material is raining down on you? And according to CARB studies, California Air Resources Board, because many people leap that this is just floating over from China, but CARB studies show clearly it's not. Heavy metals don't float across oceans, with the exception of mercury, which converts to more a gaseous state. So once you really have a clear picture of the gravity of this issue, that this toxic metal, bioavailable toxic metal, is raining down on you and the environment on which you depend, and you're inhaling it with every breath, what does one do? You have no choice but to try to sound the alarm as best you can, to try to wake people up to this issue. And it's certainly the last thing I ever imagined I would be doing or feel forced to do, but I can't see any other option here, because again, the gravity of this issue is killing the entire planet, literally shredding the ozone layer. It's disrupting hydrological cycles and toxifying the entire surface of the Earth. So when you get your arms around that, I think rationally, that's the only decision that really can be made. And as far as what I think about my conclusions as to where this metal is coming from, I would argue that there's nothing to discuss in that regard. We have film footage of these aircraft spraying at altitude, the metal showing up on the ground. If we were in a court of law, we would win that case hands down. I mean, it's beyond any reasonable doubt where this is coming from, and it's a 2 + 2 = 4 equation. So, in this case, we're talking about conspiracy, not conspiracy theory, but conspiracy. So this is really beyond any reasonable argument as far as what's going on and where this metal is coming from at this point. So the reasons, if you want me to go into, the reasons why, at least the ones we've identified, and I think we can clearly state as to why they're doing this. Would you like me to venture into that territory?
Yeah, but let's do that. I think what I'm asking, I think the listeners are wondering is, like, I always get these questions, not only from forum posters who are, of course, writing and posting on the LOP forum, but also the ones who are doing call-ins and sending me emails. They always ask, well, what can I do? I mean, I'm just one person, I'm one guy. Well, you're one person and one guy. So let's talk about more specifics. I think it's interesting to find out, and I know this, a lot of times when you're doing interviews with guests, and not specifically yourself, but just any guest in a radio program, they kind of go directly to the meat of what that person is working on. I think more interesting so is to get to know the individual. Like, where exactly did you go? How did you decide, or what was your plan, if you will, to launch this whole geoengineeringwatch.org, launch the concept, launch the idea, et cetera, et cetera? Where did you go? Who was it? Was it just that you do research online and then just came up with the concept, I'm going to build this and I'm going to put it out to the public because I think the public needs to know the truth? I mean, how all, you follow where I'm going with this. How all did that, let's take it from its infancy and let it grow so people can understand how you, one guy, did this whole thing.
Well, it's never one guy. There's always people helping. I've had people helping me as well. I'm having a little trouble with your audio, Ghost, but just keep in mind for the next question. My intent with this site, there's a guy named Mauro Oliveira who's a good personal friend who had slayed some pretty big dragons online with his work, and so I approached Mauro, and the initial start of the site was paying him to do the web work, and he's an activist anyway. And so our intent in starting the site was to have a source for geoengineering data that was not tainted with all sorts of information all over the board on all sorts of subjects, because that in my mind was a problem with the geoengineering issue, that you might find some data on a certain site that covers maybe 100 other things, some of which are maybe not truly substantiated, and so it took the credibility away from the geoengineering issue, which was unfortunate because there's so much data to confirm the reality of the geoengineering program. So my intent was to have a site that did not muddy the water, if you will, that stuck to the theme and that worked on a priority basis. And that the reason I focused on geoengineering is not because it's an issue that I was comfortable with or that felt like some sort of pet project. It's simply the priority issue. If the ship is sinking, then you plug the bottom of the ship before you worry about anything else. And I would argue geoengineering is that issue. The house is burning to the ground right now. So all other issues, if those issues, even though there's a lot of important other challenges in the world today, but if this one issue will eliminate our ability to meet any of those challenges, or perhaps even be here at all, then logically it was the priority issue for me, an issue that should be a catalyzing issue. And it has been a catalyzing issue with people of all political stripes. Nobody wants to be a lab rat in a grand experiment that appears to be, by all available data, destroying the Earth's life support systems, toxifying every breath we take. So even with events like Fukushima, that's clearly a potentially life-ending event on the planet if it unravels, and how many more Fukushimas will we have soon? If we're breathing these toxic metals in day out, we know the cognitive effect of absorbing this aluminum, and none of us are firing on all neurons at this point. I mean, although we might not have a diagnosis of Alzheimer's or dementia, we're on our way, all of us. So again, if we can't stop this exposure, how clearly will any of us be able to think in order to meet any other challenge? That's what I would argue. That's why I took on this issue. That's why the site got going, and that's, again, to this point right now, that's why unless or until these programs are exposed, we reach critical massive awareness, and hopefully people within the system that are facilitating these programs will decide no longer to participate. Until we reach that point, I don't think I have any other choice but to continue this march.
So how long has this been going on so far? Like, how long have you actually been working on this since the beginning? What kind of a length of time are we talking about?
I've been focused on this issue for well over a decade. If we look at available data as to how long these programs have been going on, I found on the NASA archives a document from 1966, a presidential document outlining the scope and scale of the U.S. weather modification programs at that time, with budgets in the hundreds of millions of dollars, references in that document go back to programs to the early 50s. We have patents, for example, for much of the geoengineering programs, which they label as weather modification then, but going back to the 50s, late 40s, we have patents, for example, for artificial ice nucleation for weather modification. That's the creation of a snowstorm out of what should have been a rainstorm via chemical artificial nucleation. We have patents for that going back to 1950. The Chinese openly announced they were creating artificial snowstorms out of what should have been rain. In 2009, mainstream media covered this. I encourage anybody to look this up. Look up Chinese scientists create artificial snowstorms. They were very open about it until they did $1 billion worth of damage to Beijing. So any notion that our government and the NATO countries aren't doing exactly the same thing is a naive notion. You don't have, for example, one event I often cite, Amarillo, Texas, May 1st, 2013, was 100 degrees on the ground. We recorded this with NOAA articles or NOAA maps as well. The very next day it snowed. You don't go from 100 degrees to snow in one day without something being very off the rails. A lot of engineering going on there. So we know what's in the snow. The snow has the same elements that we've seen in some chemical nucleation patents. So we see snow now at 45 degrees, 50 degrees. How can that be? Artificial ice nucleation says they can nucleate and cause snow at those temperatures, and we see it, and we see the same materials in the snow. So why would we think otherwise? So again, these programs go way, way back.
And what do you think that these programs are? I mean, have you gotten to somewhere where you understand what these programs are for, or why these programs were created in your own personal opinion?
Well, I don't think it's just my opinion. I think the data bears this out. Any such programs like this come down to power and control. I don't think there's any more condensed way of describing it. And even the document I just mentioned, this 80-page document, described basically their intent to play God with the weather, to decide where it maybe rained too much, where it should rain a little more. And on that document, by the way, you had a lot of federal agencies named. And again, people can look this up. We posted the whole document at geoengineeringwatch.org, or people can Google 1966 government geoengineering document. They'll find it. But you had DOD, DOE, Department of Interior, U.S. Forest Service. You had so many federal agencies involved. You had 10 or 12 major universities involved. I mean, this is the biggest elephant in the room. So it always comes down to power and control. But what happens when 6 decades of this sort of derailing of Earth's natural systems starts to come to a head? What does the military-industrial complex do then? And when it's been used for strategic purposes, as we know it has, historical record, none of this stuff is speculation. So we have Project Popeye in the 60s in Vietnam, very well documented weather mod that was so successful the UN banned weather modification during wartime in 1976. So when you hamper the system for so long and you begin to unravel the system, which is where we're at now, and you change upper level wind currents, that changes ocean currents. Now we have warm water being pumped right into the Arctic. We have methane hydrate releasing, by the way, that I encourage anybody to look that issue up, because right now that climate feedback loop has every potential and perhaps likelihood of ending life on our planet in pretty short order. So when you let Pandora out of the box, then the military-industrial complex knows how to do one thing: do even more of what they were already doing in an attempt to hide the effects from doing it in the first place. And I think that's Einstein's definition of insanity, isn't it? Doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different result. So at this point, I believe they're just trying to hide the severity of what we face until they're through making whatever preparations they're making. But it all comes down to power and control. Ultimately, weather warfare is a reality. We have competing countries, China and Russia on one side of the fence, NATO countries and U.S. on the other. So we have quite a mess on our hands, Ghost.
Well, you're saying, I mean, I understand the whole concept of they're using it for control, and I hear this all the time, not only from yourself, but from other people who are doing work in the same field or research in the same field. They're talking about, whoever they may happen to be, is using it as a form of control.
But, I mean, the they comes down
to what end?
Print the money.
To what end are they? I mean, what end are they using it for?
Well, again, when you have people trying to decide where it rains too much, where it doesn't rain enough, and who should be droughted out and who not. For example, we have the president of Iran and the VP on the floor of the UN stating emphatically their country is being droughted out by UN weather or NATO weather modification programs. I mean, I think the strategic purpose should be very clear. I just outlined Project Popeye in Vietnam. We have other examples that appear to be weather modification that certainly we can't prove, but the implications are there. When Pakistan showed resistance to U.S. policy, they almost immediately found 20% of their country underwater. Same with Thailand. When they refused the U.S. an air base, they found their country completely inundated with record flooding. So I don't think that we can possibly reasonably doubt that these programs are being used for strategic purposes on a whole array of fronts. I don't think we can doubt that. And we have historical precedent of that. Again, I just mentioned Project Popeye, and that's historically documented in numerous sources. So, again, I think I've outlined the why, and then as you start, if you have the U.S. military right now, people can look up anything I'm stating. I encourage them to. Top military brass stating on the record right now, climate change is the greatest U.S. national security threat. Why in the world, when we have military documents like Owning the Weather that states their intent to, quote, own the weather, why in the world would we think that what we see with our own eyes isn't going on? And that the military wouldn't engage in this given that they state on the record climate change is the greatest national security threat.
So are we talking about they're modifying the weather to create shortages in food supplies? Are we talking about they're modifying it in order to gain some superiority in some other foreign country to push them into some political agenda? Or, I mean, have you gotten that far to figure out exactly what you think the actual pinpoint use of it is?
Well, I'm trying to outline that, but you can't put this in one box. I mean, it appears that Africa's been droughted out for 3 or 4 decades. The countries are droughted out, brought to their knees, and it appears forced to allow U.S. boots on the ground, occupation, and I just outlined a few examples of that. Like, obviously, we know Iran's a target for our country, correct? And you have their leaders on the floor of the UN stating what they believe is happening. We have historical examples of weather mod. Again, I could go on and on about various individual circumstances where this is used, but and I think also, why would we consider our own populations exempt from such targeting? I don't know why we would. And in the case of California's drought, we know from hard science data that when you aerosolize the atmosphere, you diminish and disperse rainfall. We have examples of this, Mount Pinatubo blowing in 92, that up until that point, 92, because of the aerosols from that one eruption, 92 was by 50% the lowest rainfall year ever recorded. When you saturate the atmosphere with aerosols, you diminish rainfall, period, overall. Doesn't mean there won't be deluges in places, because there will. But overall, you diminish it. We have satellite photo of the Eastern Pacific being blanket grid pattern sprayed day in, day out. It's a 2 + 2 = 4 equation. It destroys the storm track, the hydrological cycle for California. So you aerosolize it upstream, and you disrupt the hydrological cycle, you have drought in California, period. So whatever we want to speculate as to the exact motivation, whether California is just a climate sacrifice zone or whether it's a target, we can all speculate on that. But as far as what's causing the drought, primarily, I don't think that's speculation at this point for anybody who objectively looks at the data.
Well, there was a specific reason, and I apologize. I was playing devil's advocate a little bit for a good reason. I had watched your lecture that you did, I believe it was on January 8th, and you were showing models, from weather pattern models during your lecture, and one of them just struck me. The reason why I had to contact this gentleman, just so the listeners know, and if you're tuning in right now, we thank you very much for tuning in. This is LOPvox Live with your host, the Ghost Scientist, and our guest today on our program is Dane Wigington of Geoengineeringwatch.org. That's Geoengineeringwatch.org. So, Dane, I watched this lecture of yours, and coming from a scientific background myself, when I saw the models that you were posting, some of the images that you were showing were so fantastical I almost had to sit back in awe and go, really, is this a real model, or did they somehow Photoshop this thing or create this model image? And the image I'm specifically talking about, there was one of the images that you used in your lecture that showed a map of the United States, and it literally was split in half with this huge heat index on one side and a massive cool on the opposing side, and it was almost exactly 50% of this map. And I had to literally paused it. I dragged people in the room and said, "You have got to see this map because it's that shocking." And to understand, again, like going on the same lines that you're talking about, like they're using this for some specific reason.
But you know where that map came from?
My thought was, okay, well, you have California. You have California that produces a lot of the food supply for the United States, and this massive drought where we're not getting enough rainfall, you're not getting enough growth in the food supply. That to me kind of showed, hey, maybe there is, this is pointing directly at a reason behind all of this, possible weather modification.
Yeah, and the map that you referenced, do you remember where that map came from?
Yeah, I believe it was the NOAA, wasn't it?
You're correct. Yes, that's a NOAA map. In fact, if you want to see an even more extreme map, I just posted. If they Google engineered weather extremes, I just posted 2 back-to-back NOAA maps that are exactly like what I showed in the presentation you described, but within an 8-day period, 4 days of one extreme, west being cold and the east being warm, which we just passed through this period right now, where the east, we just had thunderstorms and tornadoes all the way north to the north end of the Great Lakes. We just had this, if you watch the weather in recent days. And then the exact antithesis flipped to a roasting west coast again and an absolutely record cold east coast again, which we're about to go through right now in the coming days. So if people Google engineered weather extremes, I think that's the title I put on that piece, you'll see 2 back-to-back NOAA maps that are for contiguous 4-day periods. It's absolutely shocking. And snow now has nothing to do with elevation anymore, almost exclusively. It has to do with whether you're on the, quote, cold side of the storm or the warm side, as if a winter storm should have a cold side and a warm side. But they do now, because the jet stream manipulation and the absolutely radical artificial ice nucleation, which they're clearly performing, we see snow sublimating now directly from a solid to a gas, as we do with dry ice. And people have noted this all over the planet. It's not going to be the same everywhere. It's some people, maybe they try this test and snow behaves normally, so they think that everybody else is crazy. But it's not going to be the same everywhere. But we see snow now sublimating, in many cases, converting from a solid to a gas without going through the liquid phase, and it's what we'd expect with dry or with the nucleated material. So these radical extremes, again, the ability of this artificial ice nucleation process to cool things down temporarily in a very shallow layer, by the way, it appears to be a very shallow layer. We talked to some frequent flyers, and when they come up off the deck of some of these record cold areas, they're 1,500 feet up and the temperature jumps up 25 degrees. How can that be? Well, if you create a very shallow cold layer, it's the same as the open freezers in the market. The cold air just sits there because cold air settles. So they can create these temps on the ground, but it's not very thick, it's not very much, and the planet continues into full-blown meltdown, even though they can cool a region here and a region there. And if people look at the GISS maps, the NASA GISS maps, shows quite clearly where they're concentrating their geoengineered cool downs and creating these extremes like that which you described I presented on my lecture.
Well, and I put forth to the listeners of LOPvox and to LOP Radio, sincerely take the time to watch this gentleman's lectures. From, like I said, from my own personal standpoint, I found them very impressive. I thought your delivery was excellent. So let's talk about delivery and delivery systems, because the biggest naysay I think I hear and also read when we're talking about whether it be geoengineering, weather modification, or chemtrails specifically. Let's get into delivery systems. Have you gone into research to find out what the delivery system actually is? Who may be manufacturing the delivery system? What is it being used on? Is it more commercial type airlines that this is being used on, or is it more military style aircraft, that are untagged aircraft that are being used? Let's get to some specifics as far as the delivery of the actual product, if you will.
I've only gone into that so far for this reason. I'll elaborate what I can tell you, because if we're concentrating on the crime scene, if you will, the murder, we only, I think, need to go so far into who made the gun and why the gun works and so forth that it shoots the bullet. But your question is still valid in this case. I'm not negating it. So this is how far we've gone with this. We do have patents for powder contrail generator. People can look that one up. And I would also encourage them to look up this. Look up high bypass turbofan jet engine. And this is really a key part of the point here, because it's astounding how many academicians are simply either ignorant beyond belief and just towing the official narrative, or blatantly lying about the creation of a, quote, condensation trail compared to a, quote, chemtrail. So this recently released video was done very well in that it showed how the high bypass turbofan jet engine works. And we've known a bit about this for a long time, but we've focused on other areas. But the bottom line is, this is the jet engine that's on almost all commercial aircraft, with only a handful of exceptions. It's on most of the military tankers and so forth, with the exception of fighter jets, different types of jet engines on those, and those can leave big condensation trails. But the high bypass turbofan jet engine is, for all practical purposes, incapable of leaving a condensation trail, because it pushes too much non-combusted air through the engine, and the dynamics of that motor is not conducive to making a condensation trail. And our film footage backs this up. I mean, certainly we have film footage where, with nozzles visible and the obvious turning on and off of whatever's being dispersed. So there's no question that this stuff is payload disbursement. It's not some fuel mixture, although there could be some fuel mixture experiments going on also. Again, and none of this is either this or that equation, but I would encourage anybody, everybody, Google that. Google high bypass turbofan jet engine. I think the video was made on you'll find a lot of data on that subject, but Google February 12th, 2014. I think that's when that video was just put out. And to corroborate the accuracy of that video, I have a contact who is connected with Rolls-Royce jet engine engineers. And at least off the record, I'm being told right now that the data on that video I just outlined is absolutely accurate. So on the dispersal mechanisms, again, spray disbursement, commercial aircraft, yes. Project Cloverleaf, anybody can look up Project Cloverleaf, appears to outline use of non-profitable commercial carriers to add to the aircraft fleet. This would make sense for a lot of reasons, right? Because those in power can artificially stimulate the economy, keep some aircraft flying around in a more covert fashion. We've identified from the ground commercial aircraft leaving particulate trails. KLM, AA, FedEx. We see military tankers as well, KC-135s. They fly lower because carrying a payload they can't carry at very high altitudes, or 24,000 feet. So we've identified all the above. And the amount of aircraft, it's inconceivable, and I grant that. It is inconceivable these programs could be going on this scale and not have some big break in the dam somewhere with the knowledge of them. But yet, in our society today, how many things go on in plain sight, and people just simply are too busy on their iPads to really look up or even have a conscious thought about it. It's astounding.
So let's talk about indoctrination of the young, because one of the things I also found very interesting as well, not only researching you but researching some of the things that you've been working on, was your coverage of Disney and DreamWorks and all of these other studios who are putting out cartoons, animated cartoons that are showing these, contrails, chemtrails, whatever you'd like to talk about, or however you want to discuss it, whichever the side of the fence. But they're showing them in these cartoons. So give us a little bit about how you came about to that. Like, how did you find these? How did you come about finding that they were putting these in you know, and it's blatant indoctrination. You can see that from just watching it and saying, well, what would be the purpose of these animators putting these specific images in children's cartoons if it wasn't some form of subliminal indoctrination program?
That's a great question. Now, I'm going to back up a little bit. One thing that's caused some confusion in this movement is some people have, for whatever reason, come to the conclusion that they just started the spraying 10 years ago or 15 years ago. And then you have other people citing movies going back to the 60s, for example, that had these trails in the background. So that's caused a lot of confusion, infighting, and so forth. So now that we know historically that these programs went back even into the 50s, perhaps even the late 40s, we can certainly expect that we might see something in the sky above a big box office film. Maybe for the same reason that they put them in kids' films, maybe they made it a point, even though these programs are on a very small scale, going back that far, or a smaller scale. Maybe they made it a point to be above some of these big box office films so that there would be some claim to this being quote-unquote normal. But I believe, based on all the historical data, that those in power very psychotically and very arrogantly felt that they could play God with the weather indefinitely without consequence. And I believe that's one of the reasons why we see such an effort to make this seem normal. Again, in kids' films, we have NASA putting out programs to teach kids that what they see in the sky is perfectly harmless and normal. There's cloud books now that have many, many more names of aerosol clouds. That's what they are. They're artificial aerosol clouds, but they name them as if they're natural, compared to historical cloud naming books. So we just see simply an attempt to make the completely unnatural appear natural. And this is what we see even on, I know I comment about this a lot too, but Weather Channel, Weather Central, Weather Underground, most specifically Weather Channel is one I focus on because I watch them a lot. It's absolute theater that these guys are clearly paid to cover the tracks of geoengineering and make the totally unnatural seem natural. To watch these guys describe, again, why we have a warm side to a winter storm and a cold side, and why there's always now a transition zone of ice storm between the subtropical thunder showers and the snow, where this nucleating material is hitting the ground before it's setting up, and how they go to great lengths to try to describe why it's snowing at 45 degrees, and it's total theater. So, I mean, I think that they felt at least at one point, they felt they could do this indefinitely. I don't think there's any doubt now that the power structure knows the ship is going down. The methane alone is changing our reality by the day. Encourage anybody to look up, just Google Arctic News and look at some of the articles there. Now, one thing about the Arctic News site and the AMIG site, Arctic Methane Emergency Group, their data on the methane appears to be completely accurate based on corroboration with other sources and what we see on the ground. Where they run off the rails is some of these scientists are calling for, quote, immediate wartime scale geoengineering, as if it hasn't been going on for 60 years already and making a bad situation worse. So everybody has to sift the baby out of the bathwater. But I would encourage people to look up Arctic News and read some of the data, even an article less than a day old there right now, where basically that frontline group of scientists is saying, short of something miraculous entering the equation, we're done. We're all done. And the data indicates that on the current track we're on a very short time horizon. So back to the geoengineering and why they went to such great length to condition people. I believe, again, I thought they thought they could do this forever, but now clearly they can't. The walls are closing in. The consequences are clear. And why I'm fighting geoengineering so tenaciously is because I believe our single best chance is to bring these programs to light, to a halt, and let the planet respond. However violent that response is, and I believe it will be incredibly violent. They've kept the lid on a boiling kettle so long that I think we're in for a ride that few can imagine. But what better chance do we have? Is it not true insanity to think that flying countless jets around the globe 24/7, dumping toxic materials into the atmosphere is going to do anything but harm?
Well, and I got to say that when I'll give you a prime example of this. If any of the listeners here at LOPvox Live and LOP Radio would like to take a gander at what it is that we're discussing, the cartoon Over the Hedge, it's a children's cartoon. I actually didn't. I've watched the film several times. I've got a little niece, and I've watched the movie several times and never really paid attention to it until I saw the still frames that were part of the lecture, and I went, wow, that's just amazing to me, because I didn't notice it. And I, as somebody that's a researcher myself and involved in these types of programs and, researching these types of programs, I really didn't notice it. And then I went back and watched it after the fact, after I had seen the stills. And I was like, wow, I'm overwhelmed. It's overwhelming just to look at the sky in these films and realize, they have to purposely do the CGI in these films. There has to be some form of an agenda behind this. So you see this agenda that you get with companies like Disney, companies like DreamWorks, who are involved in creating these animations, and then you have to ask the question, are they somehow involved with these programs that you're discussing, these weather modification programs? I know, to bring up a point of that, is that we've had this discussion on the phone. You and I have had this discussion on the phone about them controlling the weather channels themselves and the stations themselves. Go into a little bit more detail about that, because I believe that the listeners would really like to find out. And ladies and gentlemen, welcome for joining us here at LOPvox Live on LOP Radio. I'm your host, The Ghost Scientist. We're joined today on today's program by Dane Wigington. He is from Geoengineeringwatch.org. That's Geoengineeringwatch.org. So, Dane, go ahead. Take us into that next step, if you will.
Well, for any that have the Weather Channel, I would encourage them to really take a look at that weather dissemination with the things we've discussed in mind, because clearly they have marching orders to make it appear as if the planet Earth is a frozen wasteland. They don't talk about the fact that Australia just had its warmest, 2013 was the warmest year ever in Australia. They don't mention, when they're talking about how cold the lower 48 was, they don't mention the fact that Alaska just had the warmest January on record. They don't mention that we're 20 degrees above normal in California day and night. I mean, almost endlessly here. Everything's dying. They don't talk about so many things that would be at least somewhat balanced. Clearly, they've been giving marching orders to help sell geoengineering in a covert way, which is to make it look like the planet's a frozen wasteland. They create a lot of confusion on the ground. A lot of people have bought into the global cooling bit. And what's interesting is people who seem to recognize the geoengineering is real don't seem to recognize its effects, and I don't really comprehend that. If we know from the figures of global dimming, which for those of your listeners who don't know what that is, that's the amount of direct sunlight that no longer reaches the surface of the planet as compared to 5 decades ago. That's about 22 to 25%. That's a lot of sunlight, direct sunlight, that doesn't reach the surface of the planet. How can that not affect the climate? And how people who recognize geoengineering don't recognize that, I'm not sure. But back to the Weather Channel and what they try to do to explain away the completely unnatural as natural, we know there's Rothschild's ownership in Weather Channel. We see Rothschilds now controlling the weather modeling even in Asia. They seem to feel they had to control the message everywhere. Why is that? Because you have to have the foxes running the hen house, or the dots wouldn't connect. People would see through these forecasts that something's horribly wrong. But so you have to control the forecast message, and they do. So let's carry that further. Who does the weather modeling for NOAA and the National Weather Service? Raytheon. Raytheon up to their neck in weather modification patents. So Raytheon is running the hen house in that example. Who does the weather modeling for the FAA? Lockheed Martin. Again, you have one of the major weather modification players running that aspect of the hen house. So they control the message. Certainly, they control the mainstream media. And I mean, for those that can't see it at this point, they're not looking very hard. So, and the guys on the Weather Channel, once you really start to focus on this and see how hard they work to paint a certain picture, and how hard they work to explain, again, why there's a warm side and a cold side to storms, how hard they work to try to explain how it could possibly, 2 weeks ago, or 2 or 3 weeks ago, it was snowing in northern Florida and 85 degrees in southern Florida. Anybody who thinks that that's normal or natural is not really looking through a clear lens. So, again, that's the job of the forecasters and a lot of people in the public. They want to be told everything's okay, so they're all too willing to buy any preposterous story if it makes them feel like they can stay in their comfort bubble. But they're not going to be able to stay there long because the walls are closing in on all of us very quickly. And in fact, think about this. How incredibly unwilling to look at reality are people or even notice the reality around them when the UV levels, and we can talk about this when you want, Ghost, but UV levels are so intense, it's burning the bark off of trees. You can certainly feel it on your face. The southwest side of trees all over the Pacific Northwest is literally scorched clean off the tree. It's down to core wood. By our measurements, UVB is at least 1,200% higher than we've been told for 3 decades. How can people not notice that? And how can that be lied about so profusely for so long, and no agency has really sounded the alarm yet? How can that be? But it is. There's no question about those UV levels. So again, we're living in a very strange reality right now, Ghost.
You've been on the lecture tour quite a bit lately. I've noticed that you did the Conscious Life and a couple other ones. During these events, have these people who have come to the events and watched your lectures, watched your programs, talked about Harp in any manner or in any fashion? And have you looked into possible uses of Harp in conjunction with this weather modification program that you believe is taking place?
Yeah, the ionosphere heaters, HARP, for those of your listeners that don't know what that stands for, it's High Frequency Active Auroral Research Program. It's an acronym that doesn't seem to really describe what the facility is for, but these are ionosphere heaters. So it's a massively, I know you know what it is, but I'm explaining for your listeners. But so the massively powerful ground-based radio frequency transmitting stations, in the case of HARP, I believe some of the figures indicate it can transmit as much as 3 billion watts. So this causes an electrical chain reaction in the ionosphere, can heat huge regions to tens of thousands of degrees Fahrenheit according to the data, which creates a bulge in the atmosphere. They can create high and low pressure zones with this, and there appear to be perhaps 24 or more of these large ground-based facilities now around the globe, and an unknown number of smaller facilities. So this is an integral part of the weather modification programs. And as the spraying of the metallic particles also make the atmosphere more conductive, that would appear to make the potential of these facilities greater. So all of these are inseparable. The atmospheric spraying, the ionosphere heaters, because we see jet stream movement now that's historically completely unprecedented. Right now, in fact, in the coming few days, the jet stream that's going to create this massive cool down, again, in much of the U.S., it's running directly from the north to the south for thousands of miles. Directly north-south. In fact, even a little bit of a northeast to southwest bend. Historically, if you go back a decade and a half or more, I've never seen any jet stream configuration like that, and I've never seen any historical reference to any such configuration. So the degree to which the system is being manipulated and the ionosphere heaters are a huge part of that manipulation it's astounding. And again, we can't even begin to know. No one can know what the total ramifications are here. There's no way to know. And now we have Project Lucy, which your listeners can look up as well, acronym LUCY. Just put Project Lucy, methane, you'll find this proposal by the geoengineers, which it appears is already probably going on, to use the ionosphere heaters with opposing frequencies to try to degrade the methane in the atmosphere. Nobody knows the consequences of doing that. But at this point, this is the attitude of the geoengineers. And David Keith says this on the record, the most internationally recognized geoengineer. David Keith is simply a prop. He's a public relations stooge, and the ego and arrogance of David Keith is mind-numbing, truly. But David Keith stated on the record at one international conference that I attended, this is his attitude, paraphrased. Well, we're already geoengineering the planet. Human activity is. And he's right about that. He's certainly right. When you cut down forests, you put 4 billion gallons of hydrocarbon into the air a day, you're geoengineering, period. But their attitude then goes to this point. Well, since we're already geoengineering the atmosphere, let's just try B and C in addition to A and see what we get. So let's just kick the bull in the backside and see what happens. And this is the attitude of these people. They don't feel they need to ask permission, have any oversight, or there's no regulation for what they do in the air, none. In fact, I've spoken in front of CARB, California Air Resources Board, and they admit on the record, even though they do this extensive air quality testing, they only test for PM 2.5 so that all these nanoparticles from the geoengineering goes under the radar, but they admit they don't have any jurisdiction on what goes on up there. There's no laws, no regulations, no nothing. How can that be? You can fly up there and dump whatever you want, no laws? That's how it is. So anyway, it's quite astounding that things are the way they are, but in regard to the whole geoengineering process, the attitude of the scientists running these programs is just that the Earth is a giant physics lab, and they're like kids in a sandbox.
So let me put forth a couple of different CT ideas or conspiracy theory concepts that have been put forth about why this weather modification or whether this, what these chemtrails may be used for or their purposes, not only from a negative standpoint, but some who have talked about it being for positive purposes on a different level. So I would like to present you with a few of them and just see what your take on them is from your point of view, if you don't mind.
Mm-hmm.
I'll start with the first one. So the first one is one that I actually have had direct contact with from Paul Laviolette's work from about 1976. And I've had these conversations directly with Paul as well with Dr. Brian O'Leary before he passed away and Dr. Doug Anderson from NASA. And one of the things that was brought to mind about the reasons behind this possible spraying of these chemical high dispersants has been because during the research done in 1976 that there's this mass cosmic particle dust that's traversing intergalactic space and is currently coming into our neck of the woods, if you will, and has been bombarding the sun and creating more of a higher energy output through CME and through disbursement of solar particle dust into our atmosphere. And one of the purposes has been proposed that these particular spraying of these chemicals is to create a form of a shield, if you will, to work to buffer these particles or deflect these particles from getting to the surface of the planet, creating havoc on our electrical grid system. So I'll start with that one more from a technical scientific term, and let's hear what your opinion may or may not be on that subject.
Well, when we have a very direct cause and effect right in front of our face, and then I think, don't we go with Occam's razor at that point? I mean, there's a lot of speculation as to certain cosmological factors here that I haven't seen the data to make me feel that applies. And to me, if I go back to what I outlined earlier, that when you meddle with the system for so long, you do damage. For example, in the ozone destruction, well, we have quite clear data now to indicate that these experiments were going on over the poles in the 50s, certainly. And Antarctica appeared to be an epicenter of it. So when we have the ozone destruction over Antarctica, which certainly makes us, as ozone destruction gets more widespread over the globe, certainly makes us more vulnerable to CMEs. So was the ozone destruction in the Southern Hemisphere really a result of CFCs, or was perhaps geoengineering by far the greatest causal factor? And if geoengineering wasn't the greatest causal factor of the ozone destruction, then why do we now have a massive and growing northern hemisphere ozone hole when CFCs have been banned for 3 decades? We have Canadian scientists being threatened with termination if they speak to media about this ozone hole. We have UVB readings, again, minimally 1,200% higher than I've seen disclosed anywhere in we're actually getting UVC readings on the surface of the planet now. That's the last step before X-ray. We're not getting big readings, but they're here, and we're told that UVC stops 100,000 feet up in the atmosphere. So when they come up with something that indicates these programs are somehow, quote, for the common good, I don't buy it. I don't buy it at all. I don't see anything benevolent in these programs. And certainly with the acronym the SRM, Solar Radiation Management, SAG, Stratospheric Aerosol Geoengineering, that the stated purposes on these patents are to slow a runaway greenhouse event, which I believe we're already in. I believe data indicates that. And as of yesterday, the Arctic News scientists are coming to that, or, they're at least admitting that conclusion. So we see the behavior with the Arctic ice. Let's use that for an example. That certainly, again, a lot of anthropogenic causes are heating our planet, no question. Geoengineering can cause these massive regional widespread cooling events at the cost of what appears to be a worsened overall warming. So you have this focus on the poles, very anomalous behavior with the Arctic ice. So in 2007, it began to crash. It appeared there was a massive ramp up in the spring. We saw a lot more solar obscuration. So they're blocking the sun. They appear to be ice nucleating up there as well, because we see very strange behavior with the ice. And we know from the test down here in the States that, the nucleating materials are in the ice. So the ice suddenly jumps back up a bit. 2012, the warmest year ever recorded in the continental U.S. I'm trying to weave geoengineering into these cosmological events you described. So we have the warmest year ever recorded in the continental U.S. in 2012, by far. 2013, miraculously, was the 42nd warmest year in the U.S. What happened? When the rest of the planet continued warming, what happened? Geoengineering happened. And so we have the ice that almost crashed in 2012, and suddenly in 2013 we have the ice extent, the surface area. Everybody saw the headlines in 2013, Arctic ice expanding and blah, blah, blah. But that was the extent, the surface areas. I know you know, Ghost. But nobody talked about the mass. The mass continued to decline. And as of February 15th, the latest pile mass ice chart data shows now we're at record low territory, even for extent. So the ice is still crashing. So if they're talking about protecting the planet from CMEs while they're shredding the Earth's natural protection, that doesn't seem to be a very rational approach to me. So the more they spray, the more damage they do, the more they have to spray to put up an artificial quote-unquote shield while they're destroying everything on the ground, literally. I mean, if we look at the list of destruction from geoengineering, it's difficult to find a starting point. So I don't buy into any benevolence being in these programs. I simply believe, again, we trace it back to power and control, and those in power arrogantly and very insanely thinking that they could control these natural systems for their benefit indefinitely. And I think now then there's things thrown onto the table that distract people as to the very direct cause and effect that we see. So anyway, and that was a long answer for that question, but I don't see anything benevolent in this, and I don't think the cosmological events or variations are necessarily the real issue here. I think it's a very straightforward cause and effect, and all roads lead back to geoengineering.
Well, and I appreciate your candor to it too, as well. I appreciate that. We're almost at the top of the hour. You're here at LOPvox Live with your host, the Ghost Scientist, and today our guest is Dane Wigington of Geoengineeringwatch.org. That again is Geoengineeringwatch.org. Thank you for tuning in to LOP Radio and LOPvox Live. Dane, so let me take the next step. So I've had conversations with others who have spoken about Harp and possibly having these chemtrails or high dispersant chemical spraying being part of some sort of new weapon system that we may be designing. Do you see this chemical spraying in conjunction with Harp being used as some form of direct weapon or a process of some form of a direct weapon or indirect weapon system?
Well, I think any way one slices it, we're under direct assaults. Everybody on the planet is under direct assault. When you can't escape what's being sprayed above your heads, and it's tearing apart the life support systems, and it's certainly a weapon, whether all the consequences are intentional or just part of the fallout. It's still a weapon, and yet we do see examples again that I believe are absolutely the telltale signs of this being used for warfare purposes. We have the well-documented purposes or instances I mentioned, Project Popeye. But, for example, to put a little more detail on the case of Thailand, which I mentioned earlier, Thailand refused the U.S. a base that the U.S. said was for weather monitoring. I believe the Thai government knew it was for weather modification. And when they refused that base, they were immediately, wiped out. If people remember the floods in Thailand a year and a half ago, or when that was, it was cataclysmic. So, yes, I think it is a weapon, and people talk about eugenics in this too, and we can go into that later. But we can certainly say that those in power know how lethal this mix is. They absolutely know, and they're doing it. So one can draw their own conclusions. But in the case of these metals, we have tests that indicate the synergistic toxicity is hard to comprehend when you start to blend all these metals together. We were given tests that indicate the toxicity of mercury combined with aluminum can increase the overall toxicity by as much as 10,000%. We all have mercury in us. Now we all have aluminum in us. How bad a mix is that? So anyway, it's certainly a weapon any way you slice it. And when you have documents like Owning the Weather, where weather is described as a, quote, force multiplier, that's a military's own description. That means this is what we want to use for a weapon. So it's certainly, I don't think anybody can really deny the use of these installations, Harp and the aerosol issue as a weapon. It's plain and simply, that's what it is.
Have you had any knowledge of, or have read or done any research on a project called Project Bluebeam?
I'm not familiar enough with that issue. I know what it is, but I'm not familiar enough with it. And I know about Project Starfish too, which I think they detonated the hydrogen bombs in it was the 50s or the 60s, and did some pretty significant damage, I think. But again, with what the attitude of these scientists, and I'll use David Keith for an example again, in the AAAS conference that I attended, where David Keith was in 2010, and when I asked him, they allowed 3 questions from 100 journalists, and I was one, but this is on film, on the record, but when I asked David Keith, after listening to a 3.5-hour symposium of how wonderful it would be to put 20 million tons of aluminum nanoparticulates in the atmosphere annually, and how great a material aluminum was because of the low coagulation rate and the high albedo and all the benefits of using alumina. I asked at the end of this conference, I had heard no mention from Mr. Keith of what studies had been done to determine environmental toxicity, human respiratory effects, so forth. And he tried to dodge the question initially, and he said, well, we've studied the overall particulate matter, and there's, paraphrase, there's so much floating around the air, a little more won't hurt. But before he could cut me off, I followed up with the point that this material floating around the air is an aluminum. Had any studies been done on aluminum? And people can see this on film. Again, Keith backed up. He said, let me be more careful. Have we studied aluminum in particular? No. Could terrible things happen tomorrow? We don't know. What kind of an attitude, what kind of a statement is that from a quote-unquote scientist, the most recognized geoengineering scientist on the planet? That ought to be a big red flag to people. They can see that exchange on film, on the record. It's in the film Look Up, an award-winning film narrated by William Baldwin that's out there on our subject now. It's in Why in the World Did They Sprang? That exchange is pretty widespread, so people can see Keith on the record behaving how the whole industry behaves. That they don't really think about the consequences. They just want to carry on their experiments.
So before I start taking Q&A or start taking questions from LOP, the forum, and from the LOP chat forum, and questions from our audience, what other information do you have that you'd like to put forward about what you're working on currently, what new things you're working on, where you're taking this to? Is there anything that you'd like to present to the listeners to get them interested in not only following what you're doing and following your lectures and what you're writing about, but what are you currently doing? Where are you going with all this?
Basically, standing on the fundamentals that we know and trying to drive the point of this issue being a priority home to people. So the things we can state absolutely definitively with no speculation, that we know there's a mountain of toxic heavy metal raining down on all of us. We know it's not coming from China. We know it matches the geoengineering patents exactly. We know the ozone layer is shredded exactly as geoengineering data says it will be if they conduct these programs, which, again, we have film footage of them doing it, so there's no doubt. So we're standing on certain hard pillars of fact here to try to drive the point home to people that this should be a priority issue for everyone. If the planet's life support systems aren't functioning, then we're not going to get very far, any of us. So my hope is that people put aside their preconceptions, get rid of their mental filters, take a good hard look at this issue and help us toe the line, help us raise awareness, because I believe if we could simply reach critical mass of awareness, many of those participating in these programs, their families and so forth. I already know of some instances of this where families are literally in civil war with one member who is a military member that they believe is involved with these programs, and the rest of the family is coming unhinged at that family member. So if we could just get it to critical mass of awareness, that's my goal, to get people to do legitimate investigation without preconception.
And that brings me, I'd like to bring up Nolo. A long time, anybody that's been listening to our program here at LOPvox Live knows Nolo from being one of our panel members of the show. So Nolo has some questions, a comment and some questions for you. So I'd like to go ahead, Nolo, take the floor.
Hello there, Dean. Glad to talk with you. My first comment was kind of fill in a little bit more information, especially that when I was doing research on chemtrails, I was a little skeptical. I like hard proof. And some of the evidence that I found you mentioned the turbofan motor, and what I found about it was 80% of its power is derived from the fans itself. In other words, it's pass-through power. And only 20% is a result of combustion. And that, to me, says it doesn't have the power to make a condensation trail of the length that we see across the sky. Right there, to me, seems like a smoking gun. I tried to have a Boeing engineer come on the panel tonight, but he couldn't make it, unfortunately. The other comment I had, this is passed along to me, is and you briefly touched on this, on that perhaps a lot of this spraying, although have maybe multiple purpose, part of it is, and this is due to their callous attitude, obviously they display when you ask questions or try and discover any information out of them, is that they don't care whether it harms us or not. Could part of this byproduct be part of a plan that's hooked on with eugenics? That it's something to try and eliminate population?
I would say this, that again, if we know certain components of this equation that are they're not speculative at all, we know that these materials are raining down on us. We know they know. We have studies from the Air Force in the late 90s on the nanoparticulate metallic particles that indicate how lethal they are, and certainly they know. We know that those in power, for example, David Rockefeller and others have stated on the record that 95% need to go. The planet won't support the population that's here. So we can start to connect all these dots and say that certainly it would seem logical, given the mindset of those in power, that eugenics would be a part of this equation. I would argue if we're going to start cutting down on populations, they should be the first to walk the plank. But I think it's hard to argue that point. And then when you have a population also that's increasingly unable to grow its own food, we can't grow anything in Northern California here now. I mean, the native plants don't even sprout now anymore. So if you have a population that's unable to really think about anything else but where the next bite's coming from, for example, or they're increasingly sick, increasingly less cognitive, then that population is going to be less likely to effectively mount any sort of resistance, whether political or to simply become aware or so forth. So I can certainly see, knowing those in power and their mentality, we have enough examples of that to see why I would think, would embrace these effects or these consequences.
Okay, this is Nolo again. Kind of a second part of collecting evidence sort of a thing. I've lived let's say all over the world. I've spent winters in Germany, in Korea, in Alaska, in Arkansas, in Maine. We encountered a snowstorm that the properties of the snow was absolutely, to put it mildly, bizarre. It acted like a polymer, this last snowstorm. Now, I collected a sample of it, pretty good size sample. What, in your opinion, would be the best way of having that examined or tested?
First, I have to say I'm very glad you guys are here and taking note of all this, because we really need people like you in the equation. We really do. The polymers, at least at the labs available to us here locally, are hard to test for, and they don't seem to be able to come up with a good option for us for that. We know with some of the patents, like the Welsbach patent, calls for a polymer fiber. And we see at times when it appears possibly a mechanism malfunction, we see areas coated with what look like spider webs. And we've tested some of this material. It's full of aluminum and barium. Again, we weren't able to test for the polymers, but we're trying to figure out how we can go into that side of the testing, because the local labs, again, have not been able to, even the state-certified labs, not been able to help us with that. But for people to do other types of tests, we just had a filmmaker from New York who tried to take a snow test, and the snow sublimated in the pitcher he had it in, so there was really no moisture left when it quote-unquote melted at room temperature. So then he packed another vessel, a plastic container full of this snow, and he put the lid on tight, and the container blew up. So as this snow gasped and sublimated, it couldn't take the pressure and blew the container up. So again, that behavior we see on many fronts of what the snow is doing. So we're trying to figure out a better way to test the snow. That's a hard thing to hide once we really get it nailed down. But we've seen here in Northern California, on some of the ponds locally here, after an artificially nucleated event, we tested the snow, we knew the material was in it, ice on the ponds for almost 3 weeks with pond water at 40 degrees, nighttime lows 40 degrees, daytime highs at 65 degrees. We had ice in the ponds for 3 weeks. How can that be? The gassing was so effective on that the ice, the pond levels dropped about 3 feet in 3 weeks. It was literally gassing the water out of the pond. So yeah, we've noted this behavior, but I'm sorry I don't have a straight answer for how to test for those polymers. And from some of the patents, they call for polymers, so we would expect them to be there, but we haven't figured out the best way to test for it yet.
I would be happy to help you with that, by the way, just for FYI there, Dane, and I can discuss that with you after we get done with the program on the radio program today. I'd like to bring it up to Tiny, who is also a panel member of the show. She's been a long-time panel member of the show. So, Tiny, you had a question for Mr. Wigington?
Yeah, I did. Hi, Dane. My question goes back to the weaponry issue. As I studied this, I saw that there's barium and there's aluminum being put into the atmosphere, and that it could either be used offensively or defensively in some type of EM capacity, a Star Warian type situation. Is this applicable?
There's aspects of this that I'm not researched enough in to really elaborate maybe in the direction you want. We do some of the relationship with the RF frequencies, for example, that if with certain frequencies these particles would repel each other, and that would, of course, make a more thorough disbursement. And we seem to see this on occasion. And now we had a 60 lab tests from Norway and Germany, and those researchers found fluoride in all 60 of those tests. And from the data we have, the fluoride has, I'm using that particle as an example to connect it with the RF frequency. In that case, for the weather mod purposes, fluoride, according to their data, if it's exposed to the right frequency, will tend to make those fluoride particles coagulate. So, in essence, if they aerosolized a big batch of moisture, so it's migrating because they've created too many condensation nuclei, so that instead of the droplets falling, the moisture just migrates. We get that in California all the time. They migrate storms right across us further east. But in theory, as that moisture is migrating, if it was hit with a certain RF frequency, those particles would coagulate, form a large enough droplet to cause condensation, and they could rain that moisture out anywhere they wanted. So we see correlations that look applicable with the RF frequency, but as far as any of the other, if we're talking about laser weapons or anything like that, I'm not versed enough in those arenas to really elaborate.
I have a question coming from our chat forum, directly from the chat site, from Rick Roll, and he asks, NASA reports have said cloud altitudes have dropped over the last decade. Could this be a symptom of weather modification?
I think the simple answer to that is that we don't have anything natural anymore, and I don't think any changes we see happening, I think we must consider them connected to the weather modification, given the totality of disruption they've caused to the system. I mean, we don't see, whenever we have storms moving across us here in California, you never see a beam of sunlight come through a break in the clouds because there's an overstory of sprayed aerosols so total that the whole sky, the overstory, is completely covered. So what does that do to the lower level clouds? And it's like it melts the whole sky together. So I don't think we consider anything unconnected to the weather mod. Everything is connected at this point. I don't think we can know what our natural situation would be unless or until we can stop these programs. The system has simply been thwarted for too long to even have any idea what it's going to do if we can stop these programs.
And that brings me up to Puss in Boots, who's also one of our panel members here at LOPvox Live. And thank you, folks, for tuning in. This is LOPvox Live with your host, the Ghost Scientist, and we're joined today by our special guest, Dane Wigington from Geoengineeringwatch.org. That's Geoengineeringwatch.org. So, Puss in Boots, you had a question for our guest today?
I was wondering if maybe the actual spraying and the metals that we've been breathing in, it gets into our bodies. Do you think that on some off chance they haven't used some form of frequencies, like let's say from the Gwen Towers, to use as a way to control people in some way? I know that sounds totally off the wall, but have you heard anything about that?
It's a very good question, and yes, it sounds off the wall only if you've not really looked at all the technology. And I always encourage people to consider, if you went back 200 years and told anyone you could talk on a box to any other person anywhere on the planet anytime you wanted, they would lock you up. So the technology now is quite incredible, and I think that there's certain fundamentals here that would lend a lot of credence to the question you just asked. One, we know we're absorbing these particles. There's no question about that. It shows up in every type of testing we do on the human organism. So, two, that makes the system more conductive. These particles are good conductors. And three, that would have to make us more susceptible to any sort of RF frequency that we're exposed to. Now, what if this was carried further to what is termed electronically stimulated biotech? And there appears to be enough data to say that there's credence for this also, that in theory, we could all be seeded with certain pathogens that might become virulent when exposed to a certain frequency. So is technology really that far advanced? I hope not, but there's a lot of data that indicates it may be. So I think that, again, given what we know, the power of these radio frequency transmitters, the fact that we're absorbing this material, we have internationally recognized neuroscientists like Dr. Russell Blaylock speaking on the record. I salute him for his courage. That the way our body is absolutely absorbing these particulates, they're so small they enter right through the lung lining, go straight into the bloodstream where they adhere to cell receptors. So I don't think it's an outlandish question at all. And I think that I don't know that it would be. I haven't seen anything to convince me that sort of quote unquote mind control would be very exact, if you will, but certainly to hamper a person's cognitive ability or cognitive function by exposing them to these radio frequency signals, given all that we know, I think that's probably quite likely.
And when you're talking about, about your analysis or about having this substance, these different substances that you guys have collected and put towards having tested, has in any of these tests shown any type of nanoparticleization or nanotechnologies, such as nanotubing or intelligent nanotubing technologies, been found in any of these samples?
I would defer to Clifford Carnicom's research in that regard. They've done much more extensive testing than we have. Now, what we did here, we tried to see what they could sift out for particle size, and they were really only able to get down to 0.1 microns that they felt confident of. So we're probably much larger than some of these particulates even at that point. Carnicom, at the Carnicom Institute, they have come up with some fairly astounding research in the category you just described, and I would defer people to the Carnicom Institute for that data. That's more their specialty. So, I think if you go to their site, you'll find a substantial amount of data on the interesting elements they have come up with. Quite interesting. Some of the fibers, some of they call artifacts, and different materials that they've pulled out of human specimens. So I would defer to Clifford on that one.
In any of these samples that you guys have taken, have you found anything such along the lines of like microcellulose?
Not that I know of, but again, on Clifford's end, that's more his arena. I'm really more on the environmental end, and here, I mean, it's the amount of change here in our ecosystems in the last decade it's absolutely unfathomable, and so we've seen soil pH changes here. For example, we have the baselines. I have the USDA soil studies for Shasta and Siskiyou counties, very extensive studies down to the acre. I have all the maps. We've seen pH changes here of 10 to 12, in some cases 14 times toward alkaline in a decade plus. So, again, there's a tremendous amount of material falling on us, but the intricacies of some of the compositions there, that would be more in Clifford's arena still.
How do you how do you see Fukushima, if at all, being affected by the way in which they're affecting our weather patterns and the weather modification that's going on? Do you see these weather modification processes or programs having a direct effect on what's happening at Fukushima currently?
Yes. Again, I don't think one could separate the two, in that right now with the contamination that's floating around, certainly if the entire weather climate system is affected, then that has to affect where that contamination falls or doesn't fall. So in the case of what we see on satellite imagery over the entire, most of the Pacific, but especially the eastern Pacific, the grid blanket spraying, total disruption of the storm track, and destruction of the hydrological cycle. So would in fact much of this material rain out before it got to us if they weren't aerosolizing all this moisture? Another variable is, of course, that with the massive dome of high pressure that appears to be part of the weather manipulation that's pushed the storm track in many cases straight up to Alaska, and then it pinwheels clockwise, of course, around the high pressure and back down to the lower 48. So, that might push some of that radiation that way in certain cases, but there's no arguing that the entire system appears to be affected drastically from the weather mod issue. And even the case of Fukushima, the event itself, and the case of Harp being able to, and other ionosphere heaters being able to perhaps trigger seismic activity. And I know that sounds preposterous to most people. It did to me, until I really read about the means by which they discovered this potential with some very, very low-powered survey equipment that in a seismically sensitive zone was triggering small quakes. And so if we compare the amount of wattage that affected those quakes in that circumstance to what the capability of Harp is, it's astounding. And certainly it would seem plausible that they actually may have had the ability to trigger seismic events. Now, hypothetically, and this is speculation, in the case of Japan, that prior to that event, it seemed there was some movement toward aligning with their regional partners. And then we have the Fukushima event. Now, I'll share something that I can only tell what it is or what happened, and people can make up their own minds. But 3 days prior to the Fukushima, or the earthquake that caused that tsunami, I had a friend approach me who lives on the California coast in Eureka. They have a relative in Army intelligence who told them to be away from the coast the Friday morning of that quake. This was 3 days prior to. I didn't give it a second thought. You hear things like that a lot, especially doing the kind of research I do. So I really didn't lend much credence to it, and my jaw about hit the ground that Friday morning. I was glad my wife heard that question being asked of me 3 days prior to, or she would have never believed me. But so is it possible that was a scheduled event? It seems plausible. And General Burt Stubblebine, the highest-ranking U.S. Army general, to speak out about 9/11, who I know, and his opinion that he told me in regard to this was that, from his connections in the Pentagon, that was indeed a scheduled event, but Fukushima was not intended. Well, if you trigger a 9.0 earthquake, things happen. So, again, in so many ways, we can link the tools used for climate engineering to total cataclysm occurring around the globe. And so now what happens if they continue to shred the ozone layer, and they are? I mean, the effect of these particulates in the atmosphere as far as shredding ozone is extremely well documented. Now how susceptible are we to a CME? Now what happens if there's a Kerrigan event now? Are we going to have Fukushima times 100 or 200 or 300? So I think we're being painted into a very deep, dark corner with all the various mechanisms we're describing.
Have you seen any other forms of technology in this weather modification, if you will, besides just the use of this chemical high dispersants?
Any other forms or uses? I'm trying to get a bearing on exactly.
Well, technologies, like, do you see them, do you think that there's other technologies that they're currently using as part of the program besides just this high chemical dispersants?
Well, certainly the RF frequency, we have on radar, we can see an unknown number of ground-based transmitters that appear on some of the radar imaging. And whether that's polarizing the particulates, in the case of barium, the positively charged barium particle is thought to be able to nucleate up to 50 degrees Fahrenheit. So is it a matter of polarization of some of these particles that can cause this quote-unquote change over to snow? You hear Weather Channel discussing, this is another term that they've just come up with, when the rain changes over to snow. Well, why would rain change over to snow unless it's undergoing orographic enhancement, rising into elevation and cooler air, or colliding with a cold front or something? But so other aspects in that regard, perhaps, and on biological ice nucleating elements, we see some potential that those might be being used in some of this artificial nucleation as well. And then again, you have Popular Science just published an article that they're finding E. coli bacteria at 33,000 feet that they theorize is being just pulled up from weather systems from cities up to this altitude. And I'm skeptical of that. You know, I've seen in the past Popular Science's role is to cover the tracks of the power structure. So biological testing perhaps going on as well. And I think right now there's probably a lot of things we can't know, but we know enough to know we should be alarmed as hell and screaming our lungs out about these programs going on.
Do you see ocean salt pumps having something to do with this as well?
The theoretical cloud marine layer enhancing mechanisms that like the ship tracks that we see, is that what you're referring to?
That is correct.
You know, on the ship tracks, I know on a lot of the radar that people theorize that those that's what the source of some of those trails are over the oceans. But I question the uniformity of those trails that we see in satellite and the length of them, how they could possibly hold together long enough for any sort of surface vessel to journey that far in the amount of time it would take. So I don't know that I've seen anything that I feel is credible that might be going on right now. I think technologically that's a pretty tough nut to crack, and certainly we see a lot of red herrings still. When any science publication is talking about geoengineering, they always throw in the space mirrors, they throw in holding up a hose with a helium balloon from the ground to pump out aerosols, and then they'll throw in maybe a jet spraying at the last minute in a way that makes it look like it's just a proposal, when obviously that is the most straightforward and feasible way of dispersing these aerosols. So I think that I haven't seen anything to make me feel that the ocean pumps are actually working at this point, and the majority of what I think we see dispersed is still aircraft.
And how do you see, like, tie-ins from other disasters that we've had? I mean, as far as like weather modification goes, you know, like the Gulf incident, the problems that we're seeing in fracking, and like talking about the green side of things, or the green movement, if you will. How does all of this that you're working on, or that you're trying to put forward to the public, how is it being, number one, accepted or not accepted by the overall green movement at hand, or how do you see all this tying into that movement, if you will?
That's a great question, Ghost, and I truly am awestruck by the ambivalence of the green movement toward this cause, or the quote-unquote environmental groups. I had a discussion on-air national radio show with Greenpeace's top scientists some weeks back, and he seemed, I think if anybody listened to that show, it would probably be apparent to them that he knows this is going on, although he's not admitting to it. And as far as the overall response, or lack thereof, I should say, from the whole green movement is astounding to me. It's absolutely astounding that they would not see this as the obvious priority issue it is. And I would argue this, that the vast majority of endeavors that the entire quote-unquote environmental movement is involved with are moot points compared to climate engineering and what it's doing. And there's people in my region that are actively engaged in trying to stop clear-cutting of the forests. And they're actually quite well funded in this battle, and there's a lot of people involved. And my argument with them is, what will clear-cutting matter if the entire forest is dead? And that's exactly where we're headed. And I make the argument that if the water's coming over the deck of the ship, polishing the deck rails isn't going to do much good. You have to plug the leak in the ship. And I couldn't be more environmentally minded. I mean, I care as much as anybody on the planet, but I simply feel you have to prioritize. And right now, I've met with the head of the Sierra Club in Northern California twice, passed on lots of data to him. I don't know where it went, maybe in the round file. You have ETC Group, for example, in 2010, the Biodiversity Conference in Kyoto, they passed a resolution, quote, a moratorium on geoengineering. And everybody jumped up and down and went back to sleep, as if that meant anything. Didn't mean anything. But you have groups like ETC, in that case, doing way more harm than any good. They would have been better off just sitting the bench, because they painted a picture that this wasn't happening and put a lot of people back to sleep, when that couldn't have been further from the truth. So I'm quite dismayed at the quote-unquote environmental quote green movement. They're so far have been no help at all, and I hope that changes.
Well, and I've had this discussion with you before about the political standpoint of, like, your battle currently with the political animal, if you will, not only in California but on a federal level. So with what you're currently working on and trying to work with in the politics, not only specifically, I would say, just in California, but on a federal level, what kind of a response have you gotten politically, and from political figures and from people who really kind of hold the finger on that trigger, if you will, to actually make a difference or a change? What kind of responses have you gotten from them?
Let me give a few answers to that. One, as far as those in academia who know, and I've cited this example a lot, but it's important here. I met with some NOAA scientists about a year and a half ago who told me off the record, we know about these programs, we're alarmed as hell, we have no First Amendment protection, we don't know what to do. That's exactly what I was told. I know some California fish and game biologists who know this is going on. They've seen the results in the streams and rivers around here, and they're afraid to speak out as well. I've been in Barbara Boxer's office, and that was completely a waste of time. I mean, I might as well have beat my head on the wall outside. But there is now, because of the unprecedented nature of some of the weather events occurring, even those who have formerly chosen to ignore this issue or marginalize it are now realizing something radical is going on. So 2 weeks ago tomorrow, I had a high-level meeting in the Capitol, almost the top of the ladder, and I passed on data, and I believe some wheels are turning there. I don't know how far they'll get, and certainly those in power know if the public at large really understood and knew these programs were going on, and they related Granny's Alzheimer's and Junior's autism to these programs, they're going to have an incredibly angry population. So they will do everything to hide these programs, I believe now. And that's why I also believe we've seen the change in direction from some of the media, like the Weather Channel and so forth now. They don't talk about the total meltdown that's going on the planet. They simply paint this picture that, again, it's getting cold, and so it helps covertly sell geoengineering. They seem to have changed direction completely, because now I believe their only goal is to hide the totality of what's unfolding to the last minute. But again, these extremes in weather, to answer your question on political wheels that are turning, they are turning. And I have contacts with some congressional reps. I know there's congressmen from several states that are now trying to connect, and I think what's triggering this, to finish my story here, is that some of these political people now realize they can't ignore this issue. The ship is going down, and they're on it. And I think that's what it's taken to get them to now start to step up to the plate. And I think more of them will as time goes on. But some are right now.
Are there any specific political figures that you think that our listeners should get behind, that you feel are up to the task, if you will, to get this out to the public, to make it more aware to the public?
That's a loaded question, because I really am not at liberty to tell you everyone I've spoken to, and I know that's kind of an evasive answer. I don't want to derail the wheels that are already turning, and they are turning. I would say everybody, your own rep, to force them. I can say one on the record because he put out a public letter. Dean Heller from Nevada wrote the best and most honest, straightforward response I have yet seen about the geoengineering issue. And his letter is available online. If people Google Dean Heller geoengineering letter, I'm sure they'll find it. Very straightforward letter. So I salute Mr. Heller. And there are other people right now that are trying to get their ducks in a row, and I don't think they want me to shine the light on that just yet, but there are wheels turning. As far as the one who's been the most openly honest about this, I think right now, is Dean Heller.
Let me ask you a question about lunar cycles. Have you noticed any difference in the amount that's being sprayed, whether it's more or less dependent upon the process of the lunar cycle itself?
That's an interesting question, and I haven't really consciously made that correlation, but now that you mention it, it seems that there have been times, I mean, I'm recalling this as I speak right now, where we rarely see spraying at night, and that's the only time I would be able to consciously connect this right now, is when I've seen this with the different phases of the moon, but that there may be some connection. I have no audio back, Ghost. I can't hear you. Having some audio issues, Ghost, again. You want me to continue to answer that lunar question again?
Okay, we're not getting Ghost. We have a few technical difficulties. We're not surprised a bit. This has been Dane Wigington on LOPvox Live. We're having a few technical difficulties. We want to thank him for being on the show and passing on this information. We'll wait just a minute here to see if Ghost can make it back on.
My apologies, folks. It seems that we had a technical difficulty over this last lapse. Just the audio dropped out. Thank you for joining us here at LOPvox Live. This is your host, the Ghost Scientist. I'm joined today by our special guest, Dane Wigington of Geoengineering.org. That's geoengineering.org. And the last question I tried to ask him before the audio dropped out was, do you see any changes in the way in which they're dispersing or spraying these dispersants due to the lunar cycle?
Yeah, to answer that one again, Ghost, I honestly have not examined or even considered that issue, and I think it's a good question. It should be looked at, and I'm finding, again, probing my memory right now to try to see if I can think of any correlation we see there. I've always looked at the correlation with weather events, incoming fronts, and so forth, but again, I think it's a good question and probably warrants a little more attention.
So let our listeners know who are tuning into the show today here at LOP Radio and LOPvox Live. What are the upcoming events that you may have going on this year? Go ahead and do you plug your site? Whatever you have that you'd like to promote to our listeners and to the guests here at LOP Radio and to Lunatic Outpost, please take the time and really put out anything that you'd like at this point.
Well, first, I'm very grateful to all of you for helping to get the word out on this most critical issue. And my hope is that your listeners will take a good hard look at it and consider if this is not the greatest priority challenge we face right now, even above Fukushima, because, as I stated earlier, if we're constantly absorbing these particulates, and there's absolutely no question we are. There's no question it's in the air. We've done 70-plus lab tests in Northern California alone, but we have lab tests from across the globe. We have a test from 1,000 whales from the most remote places on the planet that were tested for inorganics in 2010. And the report stated that these whales contain jaw-dropping levels of aluminum. None of us are exempt from this. And if we can't think cognitively, we will not meet any challenge, including Fukushima or the next Fukushima that comes along. So, the speed at which the ecosystem, the biosphere, is imploding is blinding. That we are losing 200 species a day right now, conservatively. Some estimates now as high as 300. And quite simply, the biosphere is imploding. And although there's a lot of causes, I'm not denying that, anthropogenic activity has done great harm. Geoengineering appears to be the rational priority issue. And I hope people examine this issue, look at the data, and help us to sound the alarm. And we have on geoengineeringwatch.org flyers on the front home page. You can download for free, print them locally. They're very effective for raising awareness. It's much more effective than ranting and pointing at the sky. So my hope is that, again, my gratitude to all of you at Lunatic Post for helping to get the word out, and I appeal to all your listeners to help us sound the alarm on this issue. Help us while we still have enough environment worth salvaging.
Well, we here, and I can speak for all of us here at Lunatic Outpost and at Radio and LOPvox Live would like to sincerely thank you for giving us this 2 hours of your time to come on and talk to our guests and our listeners and our LOP forum members who, of course, come here to find fantastic and really in-depth and direct-to-the-point information, such as what you're providing at geoengineeringwatch.org. And I'd just like to say thank you again to Dane Wigington for joining us today on today's program. This has been LOPvox Live with your host, the Ghost Scientist, with our special guest, Dane Wigington. And we would just appreciate all of our listeners who come here to LOP Radio and listen to the program. And again, please visit Mr. Wigington's site at geoengineeringwatch.org.